Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly vast, the entire sweep of Greek mythology, from the first breath of creation to the moment these gods faded into the stories we still tell today. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this journey without falling asleep somewhere between titans eating their children and heroes wrestling three-headed dogs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the beginning, there was chaos. Not the chaos you think of, screaming crowds or scattered papers, but something older, stranger. Picture a yawning void, a gap in existence itself, stretching infinitely in every direction that didn't yet exist. The Greeks called it chaos, from a word meaning to gape or to yawn, like the universe itself was a mouth opening for the first time. There was no up or down, no light or shadow, just potential hanging in emptiness. From this void emerged the first beings, and here's where it gets interesting. Gaia, the earth, simply was vast, patient, and fertile. She didn't need permission or a creator. She manifested because existence required ground to stand on. Beside her came Tartarus, the deep abyss below even the underworld, and Eros, not the chubby cherub you see on Valentine's cards, but a primordial force of attraction, the cosmic glue that would bind everything together. These weren't gods as we'd recognize them, more like elemental truths given form. Then came Nyx, the night, wrapped in shadows so thick that even chaos recoiled. Mainstream history tells us the Greeks personified natural phenomena, but here's the quirky bit. Some ancient sources suggest Nyx was so powerful that even Zeus feared her. There are fragments of lost plays where Zeus himself refuses to anger night, hinting at powers older than Olympus itself. From Nyx and her brother Erebus, the darkness, came Ether, the pure upper air, and Hemera, the day. Notice how the Greeks understood day and night not as astronomical facts, but as divine siblings in an eternal chase. You'd watch the sun set and think, there goes Hemera, pursued by her mother across the sky. Historians still argue whether the Greeks literally believed this or recognized it as poetic metaphor, a debate that's raged since ancient commentators first questioned Homer's literalism. Gaia, never idle, brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, from her own substance. He became both her son and her lover, which sounds uncomfortable because it was. When Uranus stretched over Gaia, arching from horizon to horizon, the world found its first shape, a dome of stars above, an endless plain below. Together, they created the Titans, 12 mighty beings who'd rule before Zeus was even a prophecy. But Gaia also bore monsters, the Cyclopes, one-eyed smiths with fire in their gaze, and the Hecatoncers, 100-handed giants with 50 heads each. Uranus looked at these children and felt something very human, shame and fear. So he did what insecure fathers do. He pushed them back into Gaia's womb, deep into the earth, and sealed them there. Imagine carrying that weight, those buried children pressing against your insides. Gaia groaned with each breath. Pain breeds plans. From her own flesh, Gaia fashioned a sickle, not bronze or iron. Those didn't exist yet, but adamantine flint, jagged and unforgiving. She went to her Titan sons and asked, "Which of you will free your brothers and avenge me?" One by one they refused, except the youngest, Cronus, sharp-eyed, patient Cronus, who understood that power requires sacrifice. When Uranus descended that night to lie with Gaia, Cronus struck. The sky screamed as the sickle bit deep, and from the severed flesh that fell into the sea, foam rose, white and churning. And from that foam stepped Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, born from an act of violence. Remember this: beauty and brutality share the same origin in Greek myth. That's not coincidental. Uranus fled into the upper air, diminished, and spoke a curse that echoes through every dynasty in Greek mythology. As you betrayed me, so shall your children betray you. Cronus heard it. He believed it, and belief, as you'll see, becomes its own prophecy. The age of Titans began with patricide and ended, as we'll discover, the exact same way. Cronus took the throne of the cosmos, and for a while, things were golden. Literally, the poets called it the Golden Age, when mortals, newly created and innocent, lived without suffering, without winter, without the need to lock their doors. The earth gave fruit without demanding labor. Justice walked unseen among humanity, and no one built walls or forged weapons. It was paradise, which should have been your first clue it couldn't last. Cronus married his sister Rhea, because divine family trees don't branch so much as loop back on themselves. Together, they ruled what seemed like eternal peace. But that curse from Uranus, it lived in Cronus like a second heartbeat. Every time Rhea's belly swelled with child, Cronus remembered his father's words. "Your son will overthrow you." And Cronus, for all his cunning, chose the most brutal solution imaginable. The moment each child was born, first Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, Cronus took them from Rhea's arms and swallowed them whole, not chewing, not killing, just storing them in his divine stomach like insurance policies against prophecy. Imagine Rhea's grief, watching this happen 5 times, powerless against her husband, brother king. 5 times she gave birth. 5 times she lost them to the same hungry darkness. But the 6th time, Rhea had enough. When she felt Zeus stirring in her womb, she fled to Crete, to the deep caves of Mount Ida, where shepherds and nymphs could hide one more secret. She gave birth in darkness, and Zeus, even as an infant, was different. His cry shook the trees. His eyes opened before his first breath. Destiny doesn't knock. It kicks down the door. To deceive Cronus, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and presented it with trembling hands. Cronus, paranoid but arrogant, swallowed it without looking. Meanwhile, in that Cretan cave, Zeus nursed from the goat Amalthea, whose milk gave him strength beyond measure. Warriors called the Curetes danced and clashed their shields outside, drowning out his cries with their war drums. Here's a quirky detail most people miss. Some ancient sources claim Amalthea was actually a nymph who owned a goat, not a goat herself. But either way, her broken horn became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, symbolizing endless abundance. Zeus grew in secret, fed on honey and knowledge, his limbs hardened by mountain air, and Gaia, grandmother of all, whispered to him in dreams. She hadn't forgotten her imprisoned sons, the Cyclopes and hundred-handed giants still buried in Tartarus. She told Zeus what his father had done, what his grandfather had done before that. The pattern was clear. Power devours its children, unless the children devour back. When Zeus reached manhood, he returned in disguise, with help from Metis, the tightness of wisdom and cunning. He prepared a potion, something honeyed and bitter, meant to turn the stomach inside out. Cronus drank it, suspecting nothing, and suddenly his belly convulsed. Up came the stone first, then Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, not as infants, but fully grown, gleaming with divine strength, reborn into a world poised for war. The six siblings stood together for the first time and looked at the throne that had swallowed them. They would not forget. But Cronus wasn't alone. The other titans rallied: Hyperion of Light, Iapetus the Piercer, Ceus and Crius, warriors of the old order. They gathered atop Mount Othrys in the south, and battle lines were drawn. What followed was the Titanomachy, a war that lasted 10 years. Imagine the sky itself splitting with lightning, mountains hurled like stones, tidal waves swallowing islands whole. The earth cracked and bled fire. For a full decade, neither side could claim victory. Historians still argue whether this represents some distant memory of actual catastrophic events, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, woven into mythology, or if it's purely symbolic, gods as metaphors for natural forces locked in eternal struggle. Zeus knew he couldn't win through strength alone, so he descended into Tartarus, broke the chains binding the Cyclopes and Hecatengers, and freed his monstrous uncles. Grateful, the Cyclopes forged weapons. For Zeus, the thunderbolt, pure sky fire that could crack mountains. For Poseidon, a trident to command every ocean and river. For Hades, a helm of darkness making its wearer invisible. The hundred-handed giants, meanwhile, needed no weapons. Each could hurl 100 boulders at once. With these allies, the tide turned. The Olympians pressed forward with fury the Titans couldn't match. Cronus, proud and unyielding, fought to the bitter end. But prophecy, remember, is patient. It always wins. The Titans fell, one by one, driven from their high places. Zeus didn't kill them. He imprisoned them in Tartarus, bound in adamantine chains behind bronze gates that would never rust. The cycle his grandfather started, he completed. The son overthrew the father, just as foretold. So ended the age of Titans. The sky cleared. The world, scarred and smoking, began to heal. And Zeus claimed the heavens not by birthright, but by might and cunning, and fate fulfilled. Yet, even as he raised his thunderbolt in victory, Cronus's curse still echoed. One day, your son will do to you what you did to me. Zeus heard it. He believed it, and that belief would shape everything to come. With the Titans chained and the war finally over, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, faced a new problem. How do you divide eternity without starting another war? They chose the oldest method known to gods and gamblers alike. They cast lots, letting fate itself decide who ruled what. The dice fell, and the world split three ways. Zeus claimed the sky, the vast heavens where storms gathered and eagles soared. He became lord of thunder and rain, his voice echoing in every crack of lightning. To Poseidon fell the sea, restless, deep, and older than memory. With his trident, he could shatter cliffs or calm hurricanes, ruling everything from tidal pools to the lightless trenches where monsters older than guts still swam. And Hades? He drew the Underworld, the shadowed realm of the dead. It wasn't the prize most would choose, but Hades accepted it with quiet dignity, becoming master of the afterlife and all the mineral wealth hidden beneath the earth. The Greeks rarely spoke his name aloud, calling him Plauton, the wealthy one, because gold and gems came from his kingdom, and because some names, when whispered, might draw unwanted attention. The earth itself remained common ground, shared by all three, a neutral territory where gods might walk and mortals might glimpse them. Mount Olympus, piercing the clouds in northern Greece, became Zeus's court, not just a mountain, but a threshold between mortal and divine, where the sky met stone and reality bent. Around Zeus gathered the new pantheon. Hera, his sister and queen, goddess of marriage, despite the bitter irony of their union. Zeus's infidelities would become legendary. Nymphs, mortals, even the occasional Titaness, and Hera's jealous wrath equally so. She couldn't punish Zeus directly, so she turned her fury on his lovers and their children, weaving vengeance into every affair. Mainstream history portrays her as the jealous wife, but here's the quirky angle. Some scholars argue Hera represents pre-Hellenic goddess worship that Zeus's cult absorbed through sacred marriage, making their conflicts symbolic of religious transitions rather than simple marital drama. Athena emerged fully formed from Zeus's skull, born from wisdom itself after he swallowed the Titaness Métis whole, fearing her prophesied son would overthrow him. There's that curse again, threading through generations. Athena became goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, favoring heroes who thought before they struck, Odysseus above all others. Unlike Ares, who reveled in battle's chaos, Athena represented controlled, purposeful violence. Apollo and Artemis, twin children of Leto, brought light and shadow in equal measure. Apollo ruled prophecy, music, and healing, claiming Delphi's oracle, where the Pythia breathed volcanic vapors and spoke in riddles that shaped kingdoms. His sister Artemis roamed wild forests, protector of animals and young girls, asking nothing from men except to be left alone. Both were beautiful, both deadly, and both utterly unforgiving when mortals overstepped. Then came the problem children. Ares, god of war's bloodlust, son of Zeus and Hera, but loved by neither. He gloried in slaughter for its own sake, often bested in myths by clever opponents. Hephaestus, the lame smith god, either born deformed or hurled from Olympus by Zeus or Hera, depending which version you believe. He found solace in his forge, creating wonders, palaces, armor, even mechanical servants. His twisted body housed the most brilliant mind on Olympus, proof that the Greeks understood beauty and worth weren't synonymous. Aphrodite rose from sea foam where Uranus's severed flesh fell, though other stories claim Zeus fathered her. Either way, she embodied desire's dangerous power, love, lust, jealousy, and ruin following wherever she walked. Married to Hephaestus, but devoted to Ares, her affairs caused as much chaos as any war. Historians still argue whether Aphrodite originated in Greece or was adopted from Near Eastern goddesses like Ishtar or Astarte, her myths blending with Eastern temple practices involving sacred prostitution. Hermes, Quicksilver messenger with winged sandals, moved between all worlds, Olympus, Earth, even Hades. Born clever, he stole Apollo's cattle on his first day of life, then invented the lyre to sing his way out of punishment. He became god of boundaries, thresholds, travelers, thieves, and merchants, anyone crossing from one state to another. Where Hermes walked, borders dissolved. Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest, kept largely to herself until her daughter Persephone was taken. That trauma gave birth to the seasons themselves. When Persephone descended to Hades for half the year, Demeter grieved and winter came. When her daughter returned, spring bloomed. It's a mother's sorrow woven into the fabric of time itself. And Hestia, firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, last freed from his belly, chose the quietest power. She tended Olympus's eternal flame and watched over every hearth and every home. She asked for no grand myths, no wars or lovers, content to burn steadily while others blazed and faded. Her presence in every household fire meant she was everywhere and nowhere, the most worshipped and least storied of them all. This was the Olympian court, not distant creators, but intimate meddlers, flawed and passionate, helping and hindering as whim dictated. They reflected humanity elevated to divine scale. Jealous, lustful, proud, generous, cruel, and complex. Unlike the Titans, who embodied raw elements, the Olympians were personalities, each temple and sacrifice acknowledging that the divine wore human faces, for better and worse. But even as they settled into their thrones, weaving themselves into mortal affairs through prophecies and affairs, that old curse still whispered. Zeus never forgot it. Every son born to him carried the shadow of potential overthrow, and his paranoia would shape tragedies to come. The gods ruled Olympus, yes, but fate ruled them all. The gods didn't stay on Olympus. They descended constantly, drawn by curiosity, desire, or sheer boredom into the mortal world. And when gods mingled with humans, children were born, demigods, half-divine beings who inherited their immortal parents' power, but kept their mortal parents' vulnerability. These heroes stood between two worlds, too strong for humanity, too fragile for divinity, and their lives burned bright and brief like stars falling across the night sky. Perseus came first among the great heroes, son of Zeus and Danae. His grandfather, King Acrisius of Argos had been warned by an oracle that his daughter's son would kill him. So Acrisius did what paranoid kings do. He locked Danae in a bronze tower beneath the earth, sealing her away from every man alive. But Zeus doesn't need doors. He came to her as golden rain, slipping through cracks no wall could keep. And from that impossible union Perseus was conceived. When Acrisius discovered the infant, he couldn't bring himself to spill royal blood directly. The gods punished kinslayers harshly, so he sealed mother and child in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, trusting Poseidon or chance to do his dirty work. The chest didn't sink. It drifted across wine-dark waves to the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys pulled it ashore and raised Perseus as his own. Years passed peacefully until King Polydectes noticed Danae's beauty and wanted her for himself. Perseus, now grown and protective, stood between them, unable to remove the young man directly without dishonor. Polydectes announced a false wedding and demanded tribute from all the island's men. Perseus, having no gold or horses, boasted he'd bring something greater, the head of Medusa, the mortal Gorgon whose gaze turned flesh to stone. It was a death sentence disguised as a challenge, but the gods played favorites. Athena, who had her own grudge against Medusa. The Gorgon had once been a beautiful maiden violated in Athena's temple by Poseidon, then punished for that violation by transformation into a monster, lent Perseus her polished shield as a mirror. Hermes gave him winged sandals and a curved blade. Following their guidance, Perseus found the Gria, three ancient sisters sharing a single eye between them. He stole their Imid pass and ransomed it for the Gorgon's location, plus 3 more gifts. Hades' helm of invisibility, a magical beck to contain the severed head, and directions to the edge of the world where night never lifts. Here's a quirky detail most retellings skip. Some ancient sources claim Perseus also received a cap made from dogskin that rendered him invisible, separate from Hades' helm, suggesting multiple traditions merged over time. Historians still argue whether Medusa herself was originally a Libyan goddess whose worship was demonized by incoming Greek religion, transformed from deity to monster through cultural conquest. Perseus found the Gorgons sleeping among statues of previous heroes, men who'd tried and failed, frozen mid-scream, walking backward, watching Medusa's reflection in Athena's shield. He crept close enough to strike. One swift cut, and her head separated from her neck. From her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior with a golden blade, both fathered by Poseidon before her transformation. Beauty and horror intimately tangled again. Flying home on winged sandals, Perseus passed Ethiopia, where he found Andromeda chained to coastal rocks, offered as sacrifice to a sea monster. Her mother Cassiopeia had boasted of beauty rivaling the Nereids, sea nymphs who complained to Poseidon, who sent the monster as punishment. Perseus showed Medusa's head to the beast, turning it to stone, then claimed Andromeda as his bride. When he finally returned to Seriphos, Polydectes scoffed at his tale until Perseus withdrew the head from its bag, petrifying the king and his court where they stood. But prophecy doesn't forget. Perseus traveled to Argos, where Croesus fled rather than face his grandson. Yet, at funeral games for a neighboring king, Perseus threw a discus that struck an old man in the crowd. Croesus, his grandfather, killed accidentally, just as foretold. You can't outrun fate. You can only fulfill it in increasingly ironic ways. If Perseus was the first great hero, Heracles was the mightiest and the most tormented, son of Zeus and Alcmene, conceived when Zeus disguised himself as her husband and stretched one night into three. Heracles bore Hera's hatred from birth. She sent serpents to strangle him in his cradle. The infant throttled them both, one in each fist. That should have been everyone's first warning. Heracles grew strong, trained in all noble arts, married Megra of Thebes, and fathered sons. For a time, peace. Then Hera struck, clouding his mind with madness until he slaughtered his wife and children with the same hands that had protected them. When the madness cleared and he saw what he'd done, his house reached Olympus. No god answered. Only the oracle at Delphi spoke, telling him to serve his cousin Eurystheus, lesser in strength, but greater in fate, completing whatever labors were demanded. Only through servitude and suffering could he find redemption. Thus began the 12 labors, deeds so impossible they reshaped what heroism meant. He strangled the Nemean lion, whose hide no weapon could pierce, wearing its skin as armor afterward. He battled the 9-headed hydra in the swamps, each severed head sprouting 2 more, until his nephew Iolaus cauterized the stumps with fire. He chased the golden-horned Ceryneian hind sacred to Artemis for an entire year before capturing it unharmed. He captured the Erymanthian boar in snow-covered mountains, dragging it back while Eurystheus hid terrified in a bronze jar. Some labors were humiliating rather than heroic, cleaning the Augean stables, decades of cattle filth, by rerouting entire rivers through them. Others were deadly, driving away the man-eating Stymphalian birds with bronze beaks, capturing the mad Cretan bull, taming the flesh-eating mares of Diomedes by feeding them their own master. He retrieved Hippolyta's girdle through battle that might have been avoided, stole Gerion's cattle from the edge of the world, tricked Atlas into fetching the golden apples of the Hesperides, and finally descended into Hades itself to wrestle Cerberus, the 3-headed hound, dragging the beast snarling into sunlight with Zeus's permission. 12 labors born from grief and guilt became the very definition of heroism. Suffering transformed through effort into something eternal. When Heracles finally died, poisoned by centaur blood smeared on a tunic his wife believed was a love charm, he built his own funeral pyre. Only the shepherd Philoctetes dared light it, receiving Heracles' bow in return. As flames consumed his mortal flesh, Zeus lifted him to Olympus, granting immortality. Even Hera finally accepted him, and he married Hebe, goddess of youth, the only mortal to become a god through his own agonized effort. These demigods taught the Greeks something crucial. Greatness requires suffering, and suffering doesn't guarantee greatness. They were bridges between human and divine, showing that even God blood couldn't spare you from grief, failure, or fate's cruel humor. Their stories endured not because they won, but because they tried anyway. The greatest war in Greek mythology didn't start with armies or declarations. It started with a wedding and a golden apple. Peleus, a mortal hero, was marrying Thetis, a sea nymph fated to bear a son greater than his father, which is why Zeus, fearing that prophecy, had forced her to wed a mortal instead. All the gods were invited to the celebration except one, Eris, goddess of discord and strife. Bitter at her exclusion, she crafted revenge in the form of a single golden apple inscribed with 3 words, "To the fairest." She rolled it into the feast hall and walked away. Immediately, 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each believed herself most deserving. The argument grew heated, divine egos bruising, until Zeus made the wisest decision of his reign. He refused to judge. Instead, he appointed Paris, a prince of Troy who'd been raised as a shepherd after prophecies warned he'd destroy his city, to choose between them. On Mount Ida, the 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, and each offered a bribe. Hera promised dominion over all men and limitless power. Athena offered wisdom and victory in every battle. But Aphrodite, with a smile like warm honey, offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta. Paris, young and foolish and human, chose love. That choice would burn cities and fill the sea with corpses. Helen had been the most desired woman in Greece, daughter of Zeus and Leda, courted by every prince and king across the land. Her mortal father, King Tyndareus, feared the war her marriage would spark, so on clever Odysseus's advice, he bound all her suitors with an oath. Whoever won Helen, the others would swear to defend that union and punish anyone who violated it. It seemed wise at the time. Menelaus, brother to powerful King Agamemnon of Mycenae, won her hand, and they ruled Sparta peacefully. Then Paris arrived under guest right, claiming peaceful intentions. Whether Helen went with him willingly or was abducted remains Greek mythology's most debated question. Historians still argue whether her agency matters to the story's meaning, or if she was always merely the prize, the excuse, the spark that justified war. Either way, when Paris sailed back to Troy with Helen, Menelaus raged. He called upon the oath, and all who'd sworn it answered. Odysseus tried feigning madness, plowing his fields with salt until someone placed his infant son before the plow, forcing him to reveal his sanity. Achilles was hidden among King Lycomedes's daughters, dressed in women's clothes by his mother Thetis, who foresaw his death at Troy. But wily Odysseus tricked him with weapons hidden among jewelry. Achilles couldn't resist reaching for the spear. They gathered at Aulis, 1,000 ships, bronze gleaming, sails like thunder clouds, but the winds wouldn't rise. The prophet Calchas revealed that Artemis demanded a sacrifice. Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter. Some versions say the goddess substituted a deer at the last moment, spiriting Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess. Others say the blade fell true and the blood was real, and Clytemnestra, Iphigenia's mother, never forgave her husband. Either way, the winds came, and the fleet sailed east toward Troy's tall walls. For 9 years they fought and raided and bled. The 10th year is where Homer's Iliad begins, not with the war's start, but with a quarrel that nearly ended it, the wrath of Achilles. During a raid, the Greeks captured two women, Chryseis, daughter of Apollo's priest, awarded to Agamemnon, and Briseis, given to Achilles. When Chryseis' father came to ransom her with gold and prayers, Agamemnon refused. Apollo answered the old man's grief with plague, invisible death sweeping through the Greek camp. Only when Calchas revealed the cause did Agamemnon surrender Chryseis, but demanded Briseis as compensation, taking her from Achilles. It was an insult Achilles couldn't stomach. He withdrew to his tent with his Myrmidons, elite warriors who fought for him alone, and swore he'd no longer fight for Greek victory. Without him, the tide turned. Hector, Prince of Troy and the city's truest defender, noble, dutiful, beloved, led his forces against the weakened Greeks, pushing them back to their ships, setting fire to their hulls. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, friend or lover depending which ancient source you trust, watched the carnage and begged Achilles to return. When refused, he asked instead to wear Achilles' armor to rally the Greeks by making them think their greatest warrior had returned. Achilles agreed, a decision he'd regret for eternity. Patroclus fought brilliantly, driving the Trojans back to Troy's gates, but there he overreached. Hector, seeing what he believed was Achilles, met him in combat and struck him down. The borrowed armor clattered on stones, suddenly slick with blood. When Achilles learned his companion had fallen, his grief shook the camp like an earthquake. He didn't weep like a man, but howled like a storm god, rage and ruin consuming everything soft in him. His mother Thetis brought new armor forged by Hephaestus himself, bronze that gleamed like the sun, a shield carved with the entire history of the world. Then Achilles returned to war, not for glory or oaths, but for vengeance. What followed was slaughter. Achilles killed without mercy, chasing Hector 3 times around Troy's walls before they finally fought. Hector fell, spear pierced, and Achilles in his madness dragged the body behind his chariot, circling the city daily, denying the prince burial. Only when old King Priam crept into the Greek camp at night, guided by Hermes, and kissed the hands that had killed his son, did Achilles finally weep. He returned Hector's body, gave Priam safe passage, and for a moment there was quiet. But Achilles' fate was already written. Paris, or Apollo guiding Paris's arrow, depending on the telling, struck him in the heel, his only vulnerable spot where his mother had held him when dipping him in the river Styx. The greatest warrior of his generation died from a wound most men would have survived, proving that even near invincibility means nothing when fate takes aim. Here's a quirky detail. Some ancient sources claim Achilles was actually killed inside Apollo's temple while negotiating marriage to Priam's daughter Polyxena, making his death not heroic combat, but assassination during peace talks, a far less glorious end that later poets cleaned up. The war dragged on. More heroes fell. Ajax went mad when Achilles' armor was awarded to Odysseus instead of him, slaughtering sheep he believed were Greek commanders, then falling on his own sword when sanity returned. The Greeks finally won not through strength, but through Odysseus's cunning. The famous wooden horse, left as a supposed offering to Athena, while the Greek fleet pretended to sail away. The Trojans, despite warnings from Cassandra and priest Laocoon, dragged the horse inside their walls. That night, Greek warriors emerged from its belly, opened the gates, and Troy burned. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, killed King Priam at Zeus's altar. Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls so no heir might someday rise. Temples were desecrated, women enslaved, and the city that had stood for generations became ash and memory. Helen, whose face had launched those 1,000 ships, was found in the palace. Menelaus approached with his sword drawn, but looking into her eyes, he lowered the blade and took her back to Sparta. Whether that was love or exhaustion, the poets never quite agreed. Troy fell, but the victors found no joy in victory. The gods, disgusted by Greek brutality, especially Ajax, the lesser's rape of Cassandra in Athena's temple, cursed their homecomings. Agamemnon was murdered in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover, that old sacrifice of Iphigenia finally avenged. Odysseus wouldn't see home for 10 years, suffering trials that became their own legend. Most wandered into exile or obscurity, their victories hollow, their glory tarnished. Only Aeneas, carrying his father on his back and leading survivors westward, would find redemption, founding, according to Roman tradition, the line that led to Rome itself. The Trojan War taught the Greeks something essential. Even righteous victory carries a curse, and sometimes the real punishment is surviving what you've won. When Troy's ashes finally cooled and the Greeks turned their ships toward home, they believed the hardest part was over. They were wrong. The gods, unappeased by victory and disgusted by the brutality they'd witnessed, turned the sea itself into a maze of punishment. What should have been weeks of sailing became years of wandering, and for some, home would remain forever out of reach. Odysseus, who designed the wooden horse and secured Greek victory, drew Poseidon's particular wrath after blinding the god's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. For 10 years, Odysseus sailed from island to island, each more strange than the last. He encountered Circe, the sorceress who transformed his men into swine, until he won her respect and her bed. He was held captive for 7 years by Calypso, a sea nymph who offered him immortality if he'd stay. But he refused, choosing mortal life and an aging wife over eternal youth. He journeyed to the edge of the underworld, speaking with the dead. Hearing Achilles confess he'd rather be a living slave than a dead king, he heard the sirens sing, their voices promising knowledge and death, while tied to his ship's mast, crew's ears plugged with beeswax. When Odysseus finally reached Ithaca, bearded and weathered beyond recognition, he found his palace overrun by suitors demanding his wife, Penelope, choose a new husband. For 20 years, he'd held them off, weaving a shroud by day and unraveling it by night, claiming she'd choose when it was finished. Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, revealed himself only when stringing his great bow, a weapon only he could bend. Then, with his son Telemachus and loyal servants, he slaughtered every suitor in his hall. Blood soaked the stones where they'd feasted. Peace returned, but it tasted like iron. Mainstream history treats the Odyssey as the archetypal homecoming tale. But here's the quirky angle. Some ancient geographers tried to map Odysseus's route literally, placing the Cyclops' cave in Sicily or identifying Circe's island as Monte Circeo in Italy. Modern scholars debate whether Homer intended these as real locations or purely mythical spaces, allegories for psychological trials rather than geographic destinations. But while Odysseus wandered, Olympus itself was changing. The gods who'd shaped every battle, every love affair, every harvest, were beginning their long, slow fade. It happened gradually, like twilight bleeding into night, so subtle you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention. Rome rose in the west, adopting Greek gods but renaming them. Zeus became Jupiter, Athena became Minerva, Poseidon became Neptune. The transformation went deeper than names. Where Greek gods were passionate and flawed, Roman versions became symbols of state power, civic duty, military might. Jupiter thundered not from wild peaks but from the Capitoline Hill, dressed in the robes of a magistrate rather than a shepherd king. In literature, the myths persisted. Ovid retold them in his Metamorphoses with such elegant irony that you can't tell if he believed them or was gently mocking belief itself. Virgil's Aeneid made the gods instruments of fate, pulling strings behind Rome's founding. But they felt distant now, more like narrative devices than living presences. Something essential had shifted. In Homer, gods strode battlefields and bled. In Roman poetry, they became metaphors. Meanwhile, new gods arrived from the east. Mithras from Persia, born from stone and slaying cosmic bulls. Isis from Egypt, mother of magic wrapped in mystery and silk. And from Judea came something stranger still, a single god who forbade images, scorned other deities, and offered not negotiation, but absolute devotion. Christianity started as a fringe cult of persecuted believers, but it carried something the old gods couldn't compete with: the promise of salvation, moral clarity, and a personal relationship with the divine rather than transactional sacrifices. Philosophy eroded belief from within. Xenophanes had mocked anthropomorphic gods centuries earlier, noting that if Harses had gods, they'd look like Harses. Plato suggested the gods must be perfectly good, which made Homer's quarreling. Lustful Olympians seem crude by comparison. Epicurus declared the gods existed, but didn't care about humanity, making prayer pointless. Stoicism found divinity in reason itself, the logos governing all, not in Zeus's thunderbolts. Historians still argue whether these philosophical movements represented genuine atheism or merely sophisticated theology. But either way, they made literal belief in Olympus increasingly untenable for educated Romans. The final blow came not through conquest, but conversion. Christianity spread through the Roman Empire like water finding cracks in stone, seeping into every level of society. Its God was unseen, singular, and claimed omnipotence. Its stories weren't about lovers and vengeance, but sin and redemption. Its promise wasn't glory in life, but salvation after death. When Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the state religion in the late 4th century CE, pagan temples were closed by law. the Olympic Games abolished, and sacrifices outlawed. The gods didn't fight back. There was no celestial war between Zeus and Christ, no divine siege. The Olympians simply faded like the last light of a long day, their statues standing weathered and silent, their altars growing cold, ivy creeping up marble columns where priests once chanted. But here's the thing about myths: they don't die, they transform. The temples crumbled, yes, but the stories survived in manuscripts copied by monks who sometimes added disapproving marginal notes even as they preserved the texts. When the Renaissance arrived, Europe looked backward to move forward. In Florence and Rome, artists painted Aphrodite rising from waves and Apollo with his golden bow. Sculptors carved Zeus and Athena in marble. Poets invoked the Muses again, not as literal goddesses, but as symbols of inspiration. The Enlightenment brought reason and skepticism, yet scholars still studied Homer and Hesiod, finding in them not religious truth, but psychological archetypes. Romantics looked to Oedipus and Antigone and found eternal questions about fate, free will, family, and justice. The 20th century brought Freud and Jung, who saw the gods as manifestations of the unconscious mind, Zeus as the father figure, Hades as the shadow self, Persephone's descent as the journey into darkness we all must make. Today, Greek mythology lives in unexpected places, in fantasy novels where heroes still quest and prophecies still doom, in superhero comics where gods walk among mortals wearing different costumes, in therapy offices where people discuss their Oedipus complex or narcissist tendencies. In every story about the hero's journey, the dangerous woman, the jealous queen, the trickster, the wise mentor, all these archetypes trace back to Olympus. Even this video, spoken into the darkness as you drift toward sleep, is part of that continuity, another retelling in an unbroken chain stretching back 3,000 years. The Greeks gave us more than gods and heroes. They gave us a framework for understanding ourselves, our potential and our limits, our glory and our hubris, our capacity for love and our talent for self-destruction. Their myths weren't about perfection, but about being beautifully, terribly human, and the gods who shared those flaws. Zeus may no longer hurl thunderbolts, and Athena's temples may stand empty, but every time someone tells a story about fate versus choice, about power corrupting, about love conquering or destroying, those ancient gods whisper through the words. The myths haven't died. They've simply moved from altars to pages, from temples to theaters, from sacrifices to screens. They walk quietly now through literature and dreams, through every tale that dares to ask the questions mortals have always asked. Why do we suffer? What does it mean to be brave? Can we escape our fate? Is there meaning in the struggle? The gods left Olympus long ago, but they never truly left us. They're in every story we tell, every dream we chase, every tragedy we endure and transform into something beautiful. And maybe that's their truest immortality, not in worship, but in the stories we keep telling, generation after generation, as the world changes, but the human heart remains the same. So rest easy tonight, knowing that somewhere between waking and sleep, between myth and memory. The old stories still breathe. The gods are silent now, but their echoes remain, gentle as a lullaby, old as time itself. If you enjoyed this journey through the entire sweep of Greek mythology, consider sharing your favorite myth or hero in the comments below. Which story resonated with you most? And if you found this helpful for sleep, you might enjoy exploring other ancient civilizations on this channel. Egyptian mysteries, Norse legends, or Mesopotamian epics, all told in the same gentle, sleep-friendly style. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as peaceful as the Elysian fields.